panel, which includes our panel. I put their details in there, but it includes Kevin O'Connor, wildlife conflict specialist from Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. We've got Katie Riming from the Woodland Park Zoo, Dr. Sam Creeling from UW. And then we also have on hand Evan Moran from the USDA Wildlife Services and Chris Anderson from the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. So we really have a great range of specialists with different kind of overlapping yet different scopes. So I'm gonna kick it over to them, and thank you so much for being here with us.
Sorry, can I just make one quick housekeeping? If you are not speaking or you're not on the panel, please mute yourself. There's a lot of people and it's hard to go through and mute everybody manually. So please put yourself on mute. Thank you.
Okay, great. I will start us off. There we go. So I'm going to give you guys a little bit of background on coyotes and coyote ecology in general, kind of delve into what our specific Seattle coyotes are like and what they're eating. So we'll start off with this kind of like first picture is pretty telling. This was in Mercer Island when they are having a lot of potential conflicts with coyotes, and you saw these signs all over the place, which I think is something that you see in lots of places in Seattle when cats maybe start going missing and things like that. So we'll talk a little bit about coyote conflict in general and how to stop it, as well as kind of the things that lead to conflict in general. So to give you a brief introduction, my name is Sam. I use she, her pronouns. I recently became a doctor at the University of Washington in the Prue lab, and I study urban coyote genetics and diet. And I also run the Seattle Urban Coyote Project, or study, whatever I call it. We'll start off with some brief, just kind of fact checking things on like what actually is a coyote. There's a lot of misnomers for them. For one, people often assume that they're really big animals. I often will see people say, oh, I saw a wolf. Oh, I saw a giant husky. It's a coyote, and they only weigh about 20 to 30 pounds. So they're quite small, much smaller than even like my golden retriever is about 4 times the size of a given coyote. They're just very lanky, so they look big. They are an omnivorous, so we call them carnivores because taxonomically, in like scientific language, they have specialized teeth for shearing meat. But when it comes to their diet, they are not carnivores, they are omnivores, and they actually eat a ton of fruit, which we'll talk about later. But I'd estimate that their summer diet is probably 50 to 60% vegetation and not actually meat. They are also ubiquitous across the United States and live in pretty much every metropolitan area. So if you're having trouble with coyotes in Seattle, it's going to be like that in any city across the United States. So you're not escaping coyotes. And I think there's a lot of reasons why we actually should care about coyotes. For one, they play really important ecosystems roles. In urban areas, they are what we call kind of an apex predator. They are in charge of controlling a lot of the pest species and dispersing seeds, and can have a lot of benefits to you and your neighborhood as well. And they're also a species that's doing really, really well in the Anthropocene, this kind of era that we're in where a lot of wildlife and a lot of natural areas are kind of declining because of human use. Coyotes are kind of this bright, shining hope because they're doing so well. They've actually, we'll talk about this in a second, but they've doubled their range. They're in every urban area, pretty much every ecosystem within North America. So they're really adaptable and just a cool species. And they're here. They're pretty much impossible to get rid of. So when you try to remove coyotes, a new coyote family will eventually replace them. So the best thing we can do is actually learn to live with them and how to mitigate potential conflicts coming up.
Here we go.
Like I said, coyotes have recently kind of doubled their range. Starting in about the 1900s, they were mainly Great Plains animals. And as we kind of removed wolves, as well as modifying habitat in ways that they liked, they were able to spread out across almost all of North America and even soon across into South America. And urban coyotes are a little bit different sometimes than our rural coyotes. They tend to be a bit bolder. And this boldness can be heritable. So they are more likely to deal better with new objects or approach kind of cars, know how to deal with some of the novelties that urbanization brings. And they have a much more varied diet. In part, this is because we have a lot of human trash that's available for them. And so they just have more different prey items available to them on the landscape. And they also are what we call behaviorally plastic. So they will change their behavior depending on what is best suiting them within an environment. And they learn very quickly. They are also at much higher densities in urban areas, so they have smaller territories. So that means there's more family groups in smaller amount of areas in urban areas than in rural areas. And a lot of this has to do with how much food they have access to. All right. And sorry, moving all of my things. We don't have an exact date on when coyotes kind of entered Seattle, but they've likely been here since at least the 50s. Some people will say as early as the 20s, but as we removed wolves and other large predators, they were able to infiltrate the city and establish populations here. They can be found in almost every green space across the city, so kind of no matter where you are, there's probably a coyote nearby. And they probably don't have too much of an increasing population. There's no reason for us to suspect that it's really increasing or decreasing. It likely fluctuates year to year, varying by what prey is available and probably stays relatively stable. And one of the cool things is they really can help control pest populations, which we'll talk about more specifically what they're eating in Seattle in a second. And so what I want to do is give you guys an idea of what it's like to be a coyote in this landscape and kind of what their day-to-day lives would be. So we'll start off with mom and dad. They're monogamous, which is something people don't often know about coyotes. They mate for life for the most part. There are exceptions to this rule, but for the most part, it's mom and dad forever until one of them dies. They den in late spring. In Seattle, that tends to be May and June, and that's oftentimes when we see conflict arise as coyotes are trying to feed all of their pups as well as protect them. And they often have about 4 to 7 pups, but this can be more, up to even like 15. So it's very variable. They have a very high level of parental investment. So just like you or I would care about our kids, coyotes are really doting on their kids as well and make sure that they are kind of getting like their best foot off in life, making sure they have lots of food, that they're safe, that other dogs are not bothering them in any way. And this kind of leads them to be fiercely protective of their kids because dogs are very closely related to coyotes, and they can be seen as kind of a threat to their pups because of how close in relation they are. And so that's sometimes where we see some of this conflict arising. And their puppies are very cute. They look like little dog puppies, just like you might get at the shelter. Um, they stay in the den for about 6 weeks. After that, they kind of start moving around. Parents start teaching them how to hunt. And between 6 to 9 months later, they tend to disperse. So they're going to leave their parents' territory and set off to find their own. But when you have a lot of pups, that means you have a lot of mouths to feed. In most urban areas, we know that they're eating lots of fruit and rodents and rabbits, and that is the same for Seattle. We'll go over the specifics in a second. And if we look at their family structure, they tend to live in family groups, especially in urban areas. We don't have as many transient individuals that are kind of setting off on their own, with the exception of pups, as they're dispersing out, are usually doing so on their own. And they typically don't tolerate outsiders in their territory, so they're very territorial, and they keep other coyote families from encroaching on their space. Cool. And so when you try to remove families, what happens is you create a nice habitat void where there's all these resources that a new family will just move into. It might be a year later, it might be 2 months later, it might even be the next day, but they will come back eventually, and probably not as long as you would think. So if we can learn to live with them, we actually might be able to avoid more conflict. Like I said, they can see domestic dogs as a threat to their puppies. And what they'll end up doing is escorting people or dogs away from their den. A lot of people will mistake this for kind of them being hunted or preying upon something. But what they're really doing is they're following you and pushing you away from something they care about, usually their puppies. And like I said, conflict is most likely to happen during this denning period from April to June. And you may see this kind of escorting behavior or barking to kind of warn you that they are there and they don't want you near their den, things like that, and chasing off dogs. And so there's a bunch of behaviors that are not necessarily negative. They're just very natural coyote behaviors, but often get kind of misconstrued or misinterpreted as something that might be considered aggressive. And so escorting is a total normal behavior. That's that following. Barking is very normal. Chasing off-leash dogs, very normal. They're just trying to protect their babies. More of the concerning behavior is when we actually see them attacking pets on leash, which is very rare. If you have an outdoor cat, this is not necessarily considered like a more aggressive actor or bolder coyote. If they're actually touching or approaching people within close distances, that can be considered concerning. If they're actively biting, obviously that's concerning. And if you see this kind of begging behavior, that's often a sign that they've been habituated or come to recognize people as associated with food. And that is a predisposition to conflict arising. Some things to note is when we do have what we might term like a problem individual with some different behavior that we don't want, it's often just individuals that are becoming emboldened and not entire family groups. Again, this typically is because of habituation, being fed either directly by people, leaving like chicken out for them or dog food, or indirectly by having pet food out or not securing trash or compost and leaving these attractants near homes. Coyotes will come to associate those things with people and people with food, and therefore they'll start becoming more bold around people, which can predispose them to having conflicts. And coyote conflicts are exceedingly rare. Between 1977 and 2015, there were about 367 coyote attacks in the US. When you compare that to domestic dog, there's 4.7 million people bitten by domestic dogs just per year. So you're much more likely to have a problem with your neighbor's off-leash dog than you are with a coyote. Not saying it doesn't happen, but if you look at it from a statistical standpoint, dogs are technically a bit more scary than coyotes. And so that leads us to our Seattle coyotes specifically. And the question that everyone wants to know is, what are they eating? So we'll start off with people's number one question here. We use some genetic techniques to figure out what they're eating. Unfortunately, this does not tell us how many dogs that they're going to be eating, because coyotes and dogs are so closely related that they share the same genetic marker with the methods that we're using. So I can't tell you about that, but I can tell you about cats. Most studies find that cats make up a total of 1% to 2% of their total diet. There is one LA study that people like to cite a lot that finds that 20% of the scats have some amount of cat DNA in it. But that is not saying that cats are 20% of their diet. That just simply means that they found cat DNA in 20% of the scats. And we'll talk about why that differentiation is important in a second. So this is a graph of what coyotes are mainly eating in Seattle. So this is across the entire population. In nearly every scat out of this is about 1,000 samples, almost all of them had some sort of rosaceae plant. So these are our apples and cherries and plums, things that we find all over Seattle. Their next common thing is rabbits, cottontails, which makes sense, which are a non-native species to here. In blue and yellow, we have our kind of more what I would call anthropogenic foods. So in blue is our proteins like chicken, pigs, and beef. And then in yellow is our kind of more vegetative anthropogenic foods. So things like wheat and corn and soy. You can see that there's a very large range of different things that they're eating, and that cats are pretty high on this list, right? So right now they look like it's the fourth item on their diet. But this is telling you how many times we found cat within scats. And so while it does seem like it's really high up, it's probably a pretty large overestimation, because a cat is a large meal. A cat is shared amongst family members and also probably pooped out more than once. So when I'm collecting scat in the field, I'm likely collecting a bunch of scats that have cat in it, but that DNA might just come from one singular cat. So this number, while it looks kind of scary, is likely a very large overestimation of how many cats are being eaten. Now, I did a little analysis and I changed kind of the scale of this, and I looked at just what coyotes were eating within Queen Anne and Magnolia. That ended up being about 70 different scats here, 77 samples. And you can see that their diet is pretty representative of the larger Seattle diet. There's a few things that change. And some of the things that are kind of important to note here is how much kind of anthropogenic food they're eating, right? We have cats up here pretty high. We have these kind of, let's see, corn and soybeans all up there pretty high. And that is often a sign that coyotes are getting into some sort of anthropogenic food, whether that means they're being fed or they are finding like cat food left outside, or they're getting into someone's compost. This is all kind of a sign that something is happening there. And so, like I said, we also had a lot of pest and non-native species on that list, which is really cool. that often means that coyotes could be actually helping your neighborhood become a better ecological community, as well as removing species that you probably don't want around, like rats, which are going to spread diseases, as well as destroy infrastructure, chew wires, etc. So coyotes can really be a helpful species to have in our communities. And on the other side of that, they're eating a decent amount of human food in these neighborhoods, which can make them more likely to have conflicts with people and come into closer contact with people. So if we want to prevent conflict, one of the best things we can do is make sure that coyotes are not getting access to kind of those human foods that might be available on the landscape. And with that, I will turn it over to the next person.
That was great, Sam. Thank you so much. I just learned a ton right there. So let me share real quick my recording here. Give me 1 second. So I'm Kevin O'Connor. I'm the Wildlife Conflict Specialist for King and Snohomish counties. Let's see. Oops. Almost there. Thanks for your patience. Yeah, there we go. So I'm Kevin O'Connor. I'm the Wildlife Conflict Specialist for King and Snohomish counties. I work regularly with anywhere where people and wildlife overlap. Coyotes are one of those species where I help, help people coexist with these animals. Coyotes are very intelligent animals. They're very plastic. They adapt to different environments. Historically, there's been a ton of hunting pressure on these animals, and now through conservation, habitat protection, these animals are dispersing, but also learning to live and grow up in our urban environments. They're smart. They can travel very far, and they're learning to adapt and become part of our environments here. So coyotes in the state of Washington are considered unclassified wildlife. And to talk a little bit about what that means, so there's different classifications depending on the species abundance, habitat, or needs on the landscape, population, all of that. So coyotes are common on the landscape. They are not considered big game animals, or protected species. That just means that there's plenty of coyotes out there. There's plenty of habitat for them, and with the need to focus on species of conservation need, such as endangered species, having the unclassified classification for them gives us a little bit more flexibility when it comes to managing these animals. So we don't currently follow or research any population management for these animals. And as we, Samantha talked about a little bit there, these animals are very common in any of the green spaces around Western Washington. We sometimes run into conflict with these animals for a variety of reasons. The unclassified status of these species enables us to provide permits for lethal removal when deemed necessary, or for a city, town, or individual landowner to apply or contract with either a wildlife control operator or USDA Wildlife Services following any kind of incident. So our coyotes, coyotes have been around at least, since the 1950s. WDFW has been receiving reports or incidents related to coyotes at least beginning in the 1990s. So, we have had the public calling in to report sightings, incidents, anywhere people and coyotes are overlapping in the greater Seattle area since that time. Examples of areas where we see quite a few coyote calls are the Shoreline, Bellevue, Seattle, Kirkland, Redmond, Everett, Magnolia, Queen Anne. These animals are very prevalent on the landscape. And when I think about Western Washington, we have a beautiful landscape out here that is that is braided with green spaces, green belts, beautiful parks. And these also provide incredible habitat for these, again, very adaptable animals. They're very plastic. They can travel far and they can move around and learn how to live with us. The seasonal upticks that we see for DFW here are again related to some of those seasonal patterns, pupping, denning, and dispersal of young animals. But we could also see that if these coyotes have a den site in a green belt or on a green area on a property, that human disturbance can actually kind of rile them up and create those conflict scenarios. So when you're moving around, we recommend staying on trails, not disturbing the natural areas that are conserved for wildlife habitat. If there's coyote activity in the area, we just recommend just kind of avoiding it and let the animals do their thing. Next one here. So the best solution for living with these animals is coexistence. Removal of individual animals may open up that territory to younger animals or another family group of animals that may not have learned how to live alongside of us. Some of these animals, again, they grow up in our urban environments. They're human averse. They want nothing to do with us. They're just after our human food resources that are left on the landscape. So by removing an animal, it opens up that area for additional animals to move in. Removal of coyotes is a temporary solution. Again, it's there are more coyotes on the landscape, and they tend to occupy those spaces relatively quickly. Relocation is not an effective tool and can often be inhumane. There are a lot of concerns with trapping and translocating animals, coyotes, raccoons, gray squirrels, black bear, you name it. There are, concerns of disease transmission. If an animal is heavily habituated to human food resources, where they're very comfortable around people, picking up that animal and putting it somewhere else, the chances of that animal exhibiting those same behaviors is pretty high. Also, here in Western Washington, there's not a lot of space to move an animal where it's not in proximity to other types of residences or businesses. So the likelihood of human-wildlife conflict is again really great. Additionally, when we translocate animals, we have found that more often than not, whether it's 40, 50, 60, 70 miles, those animals will try to return to their territory or their habitat, which can result in the death of the animal. So vehicle collision is very common, somebody shooting it or being killed by another animal or wildlife species. The biggest things we can do to reduce human-wildlife conflict is really change in human behavior. What do we have around our properties that is bringing these animals or attracting these animals to our properties? So, doing a lap around your house, looking for anything that has a smell to it that a dog might like to get into, a coyote's gonna love. So compost, garbage, fruit trees, berries, any garden that you might have. You just want to make sure that you have really great exclusion fencing to keep those secure. Or appropriate containers for those. We also recommend, hazing the animals, making loud noise, shaking stuff, air horns, the old pots and pans trick, anything you can to create and build that negative association and aversion to people. So if you are having issues or concerns about coyote, we can go over a couple steps you could take to get help. So number one, I would recommend having a look at our WDFW Living with Wildlife website. We have great information on there about the species, about attractants, deterrence, and exclusion. It's just a wealth of information. I really encourage you to have a look at that. With coyotes being unclassified wildlife, There is an option for lethal removal, depending on the circumstances, either with a wildlife control operator or USDA Wildlife Services. There's a permit process for them, but it's it unfortunately does come to that at times, justifiably. But again, we really want to emphasize coexistence. When it comes to wildlife rehabilitators, they're really only for sick, injured, and orphan wildlife. So if you see an animal, on the landscape, please contact us or rehab if the animal is looking sick, injured, or if you're seeing orphan wildlife out there. Here's our Living with Wildlife website. Again, as a ton of information about animals you may be having some conflict with. So coyotes, raccoons, squirrels. In general, we say don't feed wildlife. If you feed birds, then you get squirrels, and if you get squirrels, then the coyotes come in. It's it's all associated. It's trophic level food associations there. So we really say don't feed the wildlife. Attempting to attract one target species, you're probably going to get a lot of other animals that you're not targeting there. And lastly, again, my name is Kevin O'Connor. I'm the wildlife conflict specialist for King and Snohomish counties. If you have any questions, concerns, please feel free to shoot me an email. My email number is up there, or you can call our Mill Creek regional office, and they can help you out to get in touch with me over the phone. If you have any general wildlife questions, any kind of critter you could think of, please feel free to call the Mill Creek office. We have an excellent customer service team there that would love to help answer some of your questions. For any wildlife incident or public safety concern, like we were talking about, coyote, for example, makes contact with your dog that's on a leash, or with a person, obviously call 911 if you feel the need, or contact our wildlife, our WildCom police dispatch, and their phone number is up there as well. So that would be WildCom, and choose option 1. So that's all I have, and I will pass it off.
All right. Thanks so much to both Sam and Kevin for getting us going. This is a lot of great information. We're getting some questions in the chat. I think we'll save those until after I do just one more short presentation. So let me get that up. And my name's Katie Remine, and I am with Woodland Park Zoo, not too far from you all. I think most folks are from Queen Anne. I know we might have some folks from other neighborhoods too, so that's fantastic. So I'm here to share about an ongoing urban carnivore project called the Seattle Urban Carnivore Project. I'm representing this group of folks listed here. This is a project run by Woodland Park Zoo and Seattle University. And we're focused on engaging people with us in research about urban carnivores and with the end goal of promoting human-carnivore coexistence. So you've learned a lot of great content and natural history and some details from Sam and Kevin, and I'm going to share just a little bit about this ongoing research project. So our project has 4 goals. One, we want to better understand the carnivores that we share our landscape with here in King County, collaborate with people in our community and people across the nation in that. We want to engage many community members with us in this work so that we can all learn together and ultimately use the information that we glean to help us to coexist with these wildlife neighbors. The species we focus on include the mostly larger carnivores that live in our landscapes. And as Sam kind of alluded to, there's a few different ways of defining a carnivore. We include mainly those animals that are in that taxonomic group of carnivores. But as Sam mentioned, not all of them have a totally carnivorous diet. So we include in our study black bears, bobcats, cougars, river otters, coyotes, raccoons. We also include opossums. They fill a similar niche as raccoons, even though they're not taxonomically a carnivore. And then we're also curious about where red foxes might be in our Western Washington landscape. So in order to glean the information then about these carnivores, we employ a couple of different tools for data gathering. We use camera traps. So these are remote cameras that you can put out in nature. And if an animal walks by, it will get a picture of the animal. And so you can detect if an animal is there, even if no one is present to see that animal. So we use camera traps around green spaces in central King County. We also launched an online tool called Carnivore Spotter, which some of you might be familiar with. It's carnivorespotter.org. This is a public website, no login needed, that people can submit their observations, whether you got a photo or not. People can submit their observations of urban carnivores that they've seen across the landscape. You can submit a photo or a video. Those reports are verified. We go through those every week and double check that the IDs look good. This has been a really popular tool. We get about 2,000 reports on here every year. We're up over 11,500 total as of last count. And this data paired with the camera trap data is a really rich data set of the wildlife that we share our landscape with. And so we're really thankful to everyone who's participated in putting these dots on the map and creating this amazing set of data that we can use to better understand the carnivores that we live with. Our second goal is collaborating. We do a lot of collaborating on this urban carnivore research. We've collaborated with Sam, and we also collaborate with a number of cities nationwide and even around the world through a network called the Urban Wildlife Information Network. The goal of this is if we all use similar protocols and study designs, then we can pool our data and answer questions about urban carnivores, not just in Seattle, but looking across the US and seeing how does this compare to Chicago or Austin, Texas, or other cities around the US. So we set up our study so that we could be sharing data across the landscape. And this map just roughly shows that our camera traps are kind of in two transects, mainly that run from the more urban parts of central King County out to the more rural parts of central King County. And our third goal is engaging people with us. We have an amazing group of volunteers from the zoo, from the community. There are several volunteers on this meeting tonight, so thanks to you all. And these volunteers help us to manage these camera trap stations. So they go once a month, they check on the batteries, they collect the images from the cameras, and we collect all that back, and we are getting a larger and larger data set of photos from these camera traps that we're busy working on processing to turn into data. And we definitely couldn't do it without all of these amazing volunteers. We have about 100 volunteers that work with us every year on this project. I wanted to share just some of the fun photos that come in from these camera traps. Some of them are further out, as I mentioned, kind of more in the east side of King County. So we do get the occasional cougar, which is super exciting for us. Some awesome black bear photos also kind of out in that more eastern side of the county. This cub has just the cutest little white patch on its chest. This one's fun. This looks like mom looking over her shoulder at cubs, like, what the heck are you guys up to? It's pretty fun. And then Coyote's doing everything from just, napping peacefully in the woods to standing and looking beautiful. We occasionally get some neat photos of their cubs as well. And some funny things, like this raccoon looks like it's trying to hold up this log with onlookers. So always some silliness going on, and some really neat photos of bobcats all kind of across the landscape as well. And this happened to be two bobcats together, which is pretty unusual for us to get. But they're such beautiful animals, so cool to see. So those are just some examples of the types of photos we get, and then basically we turn those photos into data. We call it a detection if we get an animal that comes by, and we can start to map those out and learn from them. So here's one example. We can see detections throughout the year. And this can help us as we get more and more data in. This can help us to start to see, are there patterns, that line up with some of the things Sam was talking about maybe when we're seeing more coyotes being active. We can also look at detections throughout the time of day. And I think this one is particularly interesting because while there are some peaks and valleys, we do find that coyotes are pretty much active almost any time of day. And so we wouldn't, Sam was talking about the kind of behavior that you might think are, typical versus behavior that might be concerning. It seems relatively typical based on what we're seeing so far, that you might see a coyote at any time of day or night. So what do we do with this data? We can do some local analyses like what I was just showing you and start to understand patterns in our own area. We also are involved in a lot of media articles and things like that. The platform that we use to analyze our data is called Wildlife Insights. And there's an embargo period for that data of a few years, but after that, the data is publicly available. So other people can explore and use this data for different purposes. We use data to look at occupancy modeling, so seeing where the species that we live with, the patterns of where they are in the landscape, and looking at that urban to rural gradient and kind of understanding what are the patterns along that gradient, which can ultimately help our region with land use planning. These are a few of the studies. So I mentioned we pooled data with some different partners nationally, and these are some of the types of studies that data from the Seattle Urban Carnivore Project has been a part of. Some different studies looking at wealth and urbanization and climate and patterns of how species are distributed in urban areas. So it's very exciting to be able to contribute local data to these kinds of projects. And lastly, for that fourth goal of helping our community coexist with these carnivores, we work with partners like Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife to develop materials to help community members get those kind of key messages about, we have these animals on our landscape, we share a landscape, what things can we do to make sure that we're not setting up situations that might lead to conflict? And I think Sam and Kevin both mentioned some of those things. So we have a lot of materials. I'll put some links in the chat as we continue on tonight that have links to some of these posters. We have social media toolkits because, as we know, sometimes we talk with our neighbors more through social media than maybe we do face-to-face sometimes. So we have some tools that you can use for that. We also, like we are here tonight, we go do many community presentations and conversations as well. So thank you to all of you for being here tonight. Thanks to our amazing volunteers and everyone who has submitted observations to Carnivore Spotter. It really takes all of us working together as a community to understand the species that we live with and know how we can best coexist with them. And you can join us in this. You can submit your observations to Carnivore Spotter. We also have a new season coming up for camera trapping. So if that sounds of interest to you, we'll be having our training for the next year of camera trapping in mid-March. So you can email seattlecarnivores@zoo.org to get on our list for that. And these are the links that I'll put in the chat with the resources that you can explore and share to learn more yourself. We also have an event coming up. I'll put a link in the chat as well. On the evening of February 26th at Woodland Park Zoo, we have a local artist and an author coming to talk about their graphic novel called Tales of an Urban Puma. And they use a graphic novel to kind of illustrate the life of an urban carnivore. So we'll have a panel with those artists and talk about coexistence at that event as well. So I will put that in the chat for folks. And I think to wrap up, each of three of us is going to share our favorite tip for coexisting, and then we'll go on to the question and answer. So I'll start, and then I'll pass it back to Kevin and then back to Sam. So my top tip for actions that folks can take to help us coexist, one is to keep cats indoors as best you can. It's really better for their own health, as well for the health of a lot of animals on our landscape, from birds to even in some places, reptiles like snakes and lizards, and bats can be impacted by cats as well. Bats are one of my favorites. So keeping cats indoors for many reasons, but also for their own safety. So they're not, out there unprotected in the landscape. Catios are a great option. And likewise, keeping dogs on leash is really important. When dogs are not on leash, they can sometimes get curious, get too close to maybe a coyote den or something like that. And then their first response, if they get in trouble, is going to be come right back to you. And that can, if they get into any conflict, it can bring that conflict back to you as well. So really keeping dogs on leash is a good way to avoid getting into any kind of conflicts with urban carnivores. So I will pass it to Kevin to share his favorite tip.
Thanks, Katie. Yeah, my favorite tip, which I talk about for all the carnivores we have on the landscape here in Western Washington, is like I said earlier, walking around your property and looking at what kind of human food resources can these animals get into. And what I mean by that is, anything a dog would go up and sniff or try to eat. A coyote or a raccoon or a bear, they're all going to want to have a look as well and be attracted to that. So if you have fruit trees, vegetable gardens, if you have compost, trash is a big one. Please do your best to try to secure those completely. Fences that are high enough that animals can't jump over. There's also roller bars you can put on top, or just a complete structure. We really recommend keeping garbage cans in a secure location, like a shed or a garage, until the morning of trash day, so these animals don't have access to that. When these animals have continuous access to human food resources, they become heavily habituated. It's a huge calorie reward for them compared to some of their natural forage. So for any additional tips on that, please have a look at our website, WDFW, Living with Wildlife Coyotes, and it has information for all those other critters out there as well. So yeah, thank you, and I'll pass it to Sam.
Yeah, my favorite living with wildlife tip is humane hazing. So if you see a coyote and maybe you're a little wary of its being there, you don't want it to come to your backyard, besides making sure not to have those attractants, you can also humanely haze it. So that can be yelling at it. You might throw a rock near it, not necessarily at it, but near it, to get it to go away, getting big and loud and yelling at it, and it should just trot away. And that is a good way to kind of keep coyotes out of your little area.
Great, thanks. And I
Wow.
think that wraps up our presentations.
Wow, that's so fantastic. So we have copies of, I think we'll have copies of your presentation. You're going to be putting links in the chat, which we can then capture and put on our website and also include in our newsletter. So it's just so fantastic. And I have to say that, your love of nature and these really majestic animals is really coming through in your presentation, and I think it's much appreciated as we try to figure out how to manage the coexistence. So why don't we start? I know that we'll probably I'm going to try to just kind of go back and forth between the chat and a couple of questions. I know Lori, who put the panel together, might have a question to kick us off. Lori, do you want to start us off with questions?
Yeah, thank you, Beth, and thank
Okay.
you to everybody. This has been fantastic, and it's been great getting to know several of you on the phone. I think a lot of people on the call would be interested. I think we're all wildlife lovers. We all appreciate these beautiful animals, and we appreciate that ideally we're coexisting in a very peaceful way. The reason we kind of got involved in this is we were noticing an increasing number of inquiries about coyotes on Queen Anne who seemed extremely habituated, were not responding to hazing. There's been a number of incidents where people have had close calls with their dogs or their cats, and hazing was not effective at all. So I think people would be interested. I've sort of sorted through the maze of who does what and who should you call for what situation, but probably mostly for Kevin and Evan / Chris, if you guys could kind of explain what should somebody do in a situation where they've had sort of a scary encounter with a habituated coyote.
Yeah, thanks, Lori. I'd be happy to jump on this. Again, I'd like to start by saying it takes a community. It takes an entire community to identify what these animals are getting into and why they're becoming habituated. Typically, again, we see, human sourced food resources. So, garbage, fruit, things like that on the ground. So you really need to start on why is this occurring. We do see seasonal upticks in coyote calls for the Department of Fish and Wildlife. Again, a lot of those are related to normal seasonal patterns, the life history of these animals. So in the late fall, early winter, those pups are getting a lot bigger and they're dispersing on the landscape, trying to figure out what's food and what is not. Again, we see different behaviors that may not be aggressive or confrontational, but like escorting behavior, where the coyote is just kind of escorting you out of the area because it has puppies there. If there are incidents, and these incidents do occur, if a coyote approaches you or your dog on leash, if the coyote is begging and trying coming towards you while you have food in your hand, those levels of habituation are concerning. In those circumstances, we really rely on our USDA Wildlife Services partners to make an assessment on whether lethal removal is justified or not. And they have the expertise and skills for any kind of follow-up effort there. And I'll let Evan talk more about that. But if there is any kind of human contact with the dog, we consider, a bite an attack by any means. If that occurs, please call 911 or, contact our Fish and Wildlife Police, which is our WildCom dispatch. And I'll drop that in the chat as well. For any kind of sightings, you see a coyote, in the backyard, walking down the street, in a park, I think it's a great opportunity to take a picture. These are awesome animals. They're beautiful. They're great to have out there. But if there are any kind of concerning behaviors, please have a look at our website, reach out to our office, discuss, if this is a concerning behavior or if this is kind of a natural behavior. And again, if there's any kind of incident, any kind of human contact, please contact our Fish and Wildlife Police, 911. And then for any kind of community efforts for lethal removal, if it is justifiable, we can assist you in working with wildlife control operators or USDA Wildlife Services. So
yeah. So Kevin, can we just clarify a couple of the points you just made? So in an incident, and I hate to dwell on the very unusual, but it does occasionally happen. In an incident like that, you said somebody could call 911 if there's an injury, obviously, but they could call the Fish and Wildlife Police, who are part of your state team, correct? Who would come out to help investigate. We've been through this on the phone, so tell me if I get off track. But if it gets to a point where there seems to be an individual coyote that has become completely habituated and is causing difficulties, conflict situations, Then it moves over to the USDA, to Kevin's team, correct? Or I'm sorry, to Evan's team.
Yeah, so our Fish and Wildlife Police are responsive to any kind of incident.
Right.
And what that may look like is, there's a lot of gray area there, Lori, and a lot of that is, a person's experience with these animals. Somebody may experience an incident, different than the neighbor. And so we want you to call if you ever have any kind of concern, or feel you would like us to come out. Don't hesitate on that. For any type of follow-up efforts to remove animals, State Fish and Wildlife, again, relies on our agency partners who have the expertise and resources. And we are because coyotes are unclassified and a common species, we really like to prioritize the need to manage some of those more sensitive, endangered, or large carnivore game species, things like that. Does that help answer the question?
Yeah, I think maybe if Evan can share sort of what the role of the USDA Wildlife Services team would be in a situation like that, that would be helpful.
Yeah, Laura, no problem. So for those of you who didn't hear who I was in the beginning, I'm a wildlife biologist. I'm a supervisory wildlife biologist for USDA Wildlife Services. What we deal with is wildlife damage management. I and my team are in no way any type of enforcement. We're not a state game like regulatory agency. We don't manage wildlife as far as populations in any way. So what USDA Wildlife Services does is we help people with wildlife damage in situations that occur like this. We have different recommendations for you, as everybody stated in the beginning of this, like so excellently through everybody's presentations. There's many ways that we can like try to crush habituation in a wildlife population, throwing rocks, not just making negative interactions with coyotes or wildlife in general, but not any neutral. I wanted to cover that. Any neutral engagement is might as well be viewed as positive. They should be scared of you as a human being. Otherwise, we see habituation increase. So just to circle back to what we do is we can help with that wildlife damage when things get to the point where removal is necessary. So generally by the time you call me or somebody calls me, it's generally necessary. If we have, a coyote hurting a human being, taking a dog off of a leash when somebody's there with it, stealing groceries from somebody's hands, that at that point in time, we've kind of reached the point where we need to do something about it. I'm going to go ahead and post my my phone number here for you guys. You can always give me a call at any time, and we can try to make plans to help. That being said, the area that you live in is a very difficult place for us to work. With everybody that's in town in the area, the proximity of houses, pets on and off leashes, there's something that we'll have to work together with the community for places, possibly the park or some other kind of open areas there. If we could get something going for you guys, we could possibly start something there. Excuse me. Somebody asked in the chat earlier, how many coyotes do you think in this family group in the area? So since we started taking calls about 5 years ago from that area, we've had people in the area kind of monitoring and seeing what's happening. I believe at this point in time, there's probably about 5 to 7 in the family group. As Dr. Creeling said, hopefully I said your name correctly. You'll see those family groups, they'll disperse at times. What I see in urban coyotes, not especially, but more often, is that generally they'll keep back 1, 2, maybe 3 of their pups from the year to try to help gather food and resources for the pups of the year. And when that kind of occurs and the habituation is already started, generally we're at that removal stage. And then when coyotes move into that open niche, that's when the community comes together with all these other tools and creates a good population of coyotes that are not habituated. And you know, the people in your community are well educated on how to keep them not habituated. So sorry, I should have put something together there, but thank you for bringing me in on the conversation. I just want to reinforce the fact that my job here is not to remove every coyote. I don't want to remove any coyotes. I want good coyotes and not have to do that, you know, as we're good stewards of the land. So it's nice to meet everybody. I'll drop my number in here. And if you have any questions, I'm still here. I'm not signing off, but I'll go ahead and pass it over
Okay.
to anybody else.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for that. So if anybody has questions, I think we have a couple in the chat, but if anybody wants to raise their hand, we can unmute you.
Can I?
Otherwise, yeah, okay, yes, go ahead. Yes, Sophia, let me unmute you. Or you can unmute yourself, Sophia.
Hi, I just had a question about when or like what factors go into making a safe choice of when to engage in a hazing behavior. So like if you see a coyote, maybe they're doing that escorting, or like say you're in your yard and a coyote walks past you on the street. When are you making a safe choice to haze them versus like you don't want to get into a more dangerous situation, like you're not probably going to be attacked, but what do you want to consider?
Yeah, I can jump on this one. So thank you for the question, Sophia. That's a really good one. I really encourage everyone to humanely haze the animals. Basically, anytime you see them, we really want to build that negative association with people. I always say first, if you're just seeing it walk down the road, take a picture. It's really cool to see these animals. Or if they're walking in your backyard, take a picture and then start making lots of noise. Clapping, banging on something. Let them know that they're not welcome there. Make them uncomfortable to be there. But only do so if you feel safe and you feel comfortable to do so. I want to make that really clear that as long as you feel safe and really comfortable to do that, please, make lots of noise, throw tennis balls, something that's not going to hurt the animals, to help build that negative association. If you're being approached by a coyote with the escort behavior, or a coyote is looking to you for food or anything else, don't run. Running can trigger that chase behavior. Stand tall, make yourself look big, flap a jacket, yell, 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 make lots of noise. Coyotes are human averse in general. Let them know that you're human, you're not on the menu. And by making all that racket, it helps alert other people in the area. So a neighbor might hear you, a neighbor might see you, bring more people together, which is really a good thing. If there's kids, a small dog, pick them up, hold them. If you're with other people, stand together, and again, just make a ton of noise. And that is humane hazing. So, yeah, I think that's all I got. If anybody else would like to add to that.
Yeah, I think, and I'll probably pass it to Sam for this, but I think there's a couple of instances where you wouldn't want to, and that would be around a den. But Sam, I don't know, do you want to talk more about that? Okay, so yeah, just essentially recognizing that, there are some spaces in our city that are coyote spaces where they're raising their family. And so it's best to give those spaces, a wide berth, but you wouldn't want to be hazing a coyote in what's sort of their home space. So that's something to keep in mind.
Okay, all right, thanks for that. I'm just looking at the chat, and I know it feels like we're kind of like circling around some questions, but that have maybe been answered. But I know that our community, Dustin mentioned, we've all had interactions that you mentioned: dog spitting on a leash, person injured, while trying to protect their dog. Coyote chasing a person home. And I think what would be really great is if, again, even if it feels very repetitive, if you could just all reiterate what we should be doing as a community, especially in these kind of higher interaction situations where we may be dealing with habituated coyotes, as opposed to like maybe just what Sophia was mentioning in terms of just like a little bit more normal day-to-day behavior.
And I couldn't figure out how to raise my hand on the on the screen. Is this good enough?
Yeah, that's good.
So,
You got it.
so I've got sort of questions, thoughts. So I live directly across the street from the cemetery. We've been here about 23 years, and I think I heard you say you guys have been monitoring it for about 5 years, which feels about right, right? And I, 3-4 years ago, I remember seeing a coyote walking by. I was going, "Oh my gosh, that's awesome! So cool, right? Wildlife coexist, fantastic, right?" But lately, a few things pop, right? For our neighborhood, for here, for the number of instances that feel like harassment, that feel like it's gone too far, it's really gotten out of control right here with us, with coyotes chasing people into their houses with groceries, going after grabbing small pets. We got people scared to, walk their kids outside. Yeah, all those things, right? And so, and I don't think it feels like there's a trend shift where I don't know how reasonable it is to think that these animals are not going to get habituated, right? They're here. We're not going anywhere. They're interacting with people. They're getting more and more comfortable. Their offspring are learning from their parents to get more comfortable, right? And, so we're just experience way, way, way more than ever before, right? Whether that's a trend or whatever. And so they weren't here for 15 years. They're at least, 20 of the years that I've lived here. And all of a sudden they showed up. But I'm hearing relocation isn't going to work because if you relocate them, something else is going to happen. But, eventually and look, the world's changing in a lot of ways, right? Global warming, et cetera, government, they may not behave the same way going forward either. They may just be getting more and more agitated, right? So I guess my question is, what are the thresholds that need to be crossed before something really significant happens? Like in terms of, gathering them all up. We talked about chance of getting bit by dogs is higher. Well, yeah, of course it is, because there's a ton more dogs in our neighborhoods. And if we did get bit, we'd go to the owners, right? But we have dog catchers who catch stray dogs and take them to, shelters. But we're not doing that with coyotes here when they're actually actively doing things that are provocative in our neighborhood, right? And again, thought it was cool, but it's just it's going on a lot here. So anyway, and knowing what the thresholds are when we really do something, call someone. What is going to happen, since the belief is, moving them somewhere else isn't going to change because they're just going to come back. So what can happen if this behavior continues to progress and continues to get worse? Some kid gets bit, more dogs get, killed or attacked, right? And even one dog, one cat, that's a family member to people, right? So I mean that's a huge thing. The stats don't matter if it's your cat or your dog, right? So I don't know,
So
What do
one,
you
Dustin,
think, Ken?
I didn't want to cut you off, Dustin, if you're about to jump in there, because you guys have sort of directly seen it. I've seen them from afar and do the whole run away. Maybe I smell or something. They don't come after me, but I have noticed it a lot more. But I know Dustin, you and some other folks
Ken,
have had more closer.
yeah, Ken, I think between you and Dustin with his comment in the chat, I would think our panel kind of has the gist of the question. So maybe we could throw it to them to answer. Thank you.
does anyone mind if I start with this one? So I want to point to a couple things. So one, we are noticing coyotes more often. They've likely been in your neighborhood for longer than even you have noticed. There's a couple of reasons for this. One, more people are staying home more of the time because there's a lot of work from home, right? So more people are retiring in this neighborhood, right? As this population ages, you're probably spending more time at home than you did before. So you're going to notice the animals and wildlife in that neighborhood more often. And three, we have things like Facebook and Instagram, Twitter, et cetera, all these social media platforms that next door that allow us to showcase what we've seen and what we've experienced a little bit more freely than we maybe could have about 15 years ago. So that's one of the reasons why I think that this is a little bit more easy to talk about and see it happening more and more frequently. Secondly, I totally understand. I have dogs, I've had cats. I would never want them to get hurt. I've lived in a lot of places with coyotes. I had really small dogs. I lived in Lake Tahoe for a long time. We always made sure to go out with our dogs every single time. We had Shih Tzus, they're really small. That's a good coyote snack. And so it's not the coyote's fault if my dog gets eaten, really, because it's my dog and I need to watch my dog. That is my responsibility. So it's a little bit of a framework shift, right? Similarly with a cat, right? There is, if you know, we all love our pets and we want the best for them. Vets will tell you, humane societies will tell you, wildlife specialists will tell you the best thing for your cat is to keep it inside. Catios are a great option. Putting it on a leash is a great option if you can leash train it, right? But a cat outdoors, yes, it can fight for itself, but it might get eaten by a coyote. It might get in a fight with another cat. It might get in a fight with another raccoon. I've seen more dead cats from cars than I have from coyotes, and I've been out here studying them for 4 years. And so there's well, one, there's lots of misinformation about these things, and two, there's a lot of mitigating factors that we can do prior to these kind of steps needing to happen. And it is, in my opinion at least, on the responsibility of the people to make sure that it doesn't get to this state. Reality is these, coyotes get lethally removed, and what's going to happen is another coyote family is going to move in. And if the human behavior is exactly the same in those regions, then this is a cycle that is going to repeat again and again and again. And so it takes that really difficult step of changing human behavior first. You can remove these coyotes and sure, the problem's going to go away for a little bit, right? But if we have these attractants still, if we have all the outdoor pets, et cetera, then the next coyote family is going to have to get removed a couple of years later, right? So it's really starts with human behavior change, and then animals will adjust to that.
Can I jump in and say something real quick? All the presentations are great. I love all the information. One thing that I personally get a little bit frustrated is kind of saying the same information and not acknowledging what we're talking about. So right now you say, take your dogs out on a leash. We've had countless, not one or two, but countless times where small dogs are getting attacked while on leash. So it's not my dog's outside and a coyote comes and gets them. And I get that the solution is for us to be more vigilant about garbage and there's not anything we can do. And that's the answer. And there's not, okay, that's fine. But to continue to say, take your dog out on leash, don't let your cat out and then to also say, well, we'll step in and do something if somebody gets bit or if a dog gets bit. We have had all of those things already. And so again, if the answer is there's nothing for us to do, deal with the coyotes, monitor your trash, take a stick with you, then that's fine. But you guys keep telling us as the panel that, well, once it escalates to a certain point, then we would do something. And calling the police isn't going to resolve or prevent the situation in the immediate moment. It'll take somebody to the hospital if they need, if they need that sort of care. But none of this is a preventative other than keep your trash clean, keep your gardens fenced, and keep your dog on a leash so the coyote comes up close to you. I mean, that's where we're at.
Yeah, and I'll just say, I think Kevin and Evan provided some good information, and I'll pass it over to Chris after about when we do get to that situation where there probably is a coyote. They're very individual, they're very different than one another. So it could be that it's one or two individuals who have gotten to this point, and I'll pass it over to Chris to talk about that. I think what Sam was emphasizing was that, okay, that situation may need to be dealt with in a different way. But once that situation is over, unless the community works together to take those preventative actions, it's just going to happen again. So I think that's really what Sam was stressing, but I'll pass it over to Chris.
No, I think that's the point. I mean, the point is this, we're making the same point that you're making, is that we see this over and over. And so it's kind of the same thing on both sides. And control of coyotes in an urban environment is also very difficult with safety, as far as like putting people out there with traps or with guns, and with people around. So the fact of the matter is that we have coyotes all around us. They're about as common as rats. I've had people ask me to remove crows in my career. I've had people ask me to remove raccoons. I've had people ask me to remove coyotes, all of that. And I get it. I totally, all of us get it. I've had issues with these animals in my area as well. But I think that's the point right there is particularly with coyote and black bear, for example, that have huge ranges as far as where they exist in North America. This is an issue for these animals everywhere. And it's always the same theme. Unfortunately, tackling one individual will not rid the situation. We've had this in Magnolia and Queen Anne before. Magnolia, a real large one, was maybe in 2009 where we had the coyotes were being fed. They were being fed at a cat colony. And and they were removed. And I believe USDA working with our enforcement as well at that time. They were around the cemetery and some other areas in there. And at the same time, we knew coyotes were in the area in Queen Anne as well. They're in the cemetery area, and that was quite a long time ago. Um, so it's not just keeping your animals on leash. I get that. You know, it's not necessarily carrot on stick. I've talked to some people in Queen Anne and some other places about, you know, altering some of your backyard spaces for your pets. So for example, providing an enclosure for your small dogs, just like we talk about with cats, a run. I have a run up, I'm in the Everett area and I have a run for my Australian cattle dog because of coyotes in the area. So I can let her out and she's the same size or bigger than them. So, you know, and these can be done with different cheap things. I mean, I've seen people build runs with just chicken wire, with, you know, with pallets and then planting the pallets with plants, which is kind of neat. Although, you know, you got to replace that because it will degrade. But you know, so there are some other options out there. I do get that it, you know, you know, the focus is on the animal or animals that are causing heightened experience un undesired and you know in a situation where people are concerned. But I also will relay that this is not the only place in Seattle that we're seeing this. It's not the only place in King County or Washington. Um, and it's not the only place in North America. Arguably, Coyote is now in South America. They really feel that they are occupying the Darien Gap. And so you've got an animal that goes from coast to coast, Arctic all the way down to Panama Canal and is now moving into another continent. We're not getting rid of it, unfortunately. That's my point. So it's a hard thing to say, you know, hey, let's just get rid of them. Coyote is really a very, very good example of we don't live in a vacuum, and they're an animal that has been tried to be eradicated many, many times throughout its history, and it's failed as opposed to wolves. We eradicated wolves from most of their range. We never could do that with coyote in the lower 58 or anywhere else. They just, the way that they are in the middle part of the trophic structure, they are designed to stay on the landscape. And so the best thing we can do is take some extra precautions when we're in a spike like this, which I know is inconvenient. And it's unfortunate because usually it's not the people's fault that's on these kind of talks. It's someone else or some people in the community that are feeling they're doing the right thing and they're putting, you know, for example, like feeding a cat colony. That I have no problem with that, but when it attracts coyotes and other wildlife, that's when we get into these situations. So having those things managed in a better manner, and having that networking in the community so people understand what might be the issue. You know, another example, not with coyotes, but I was having problems with raccoons. I think it was in the Laurelhurst area. Is one of the first things I ever had when I came on. And these people are at wits' end and they had raccoons that were, you know, also attacking labs and things like that. So they're a carnivore as well. It was a retired veterinarian that was feeding all the raccoons cat food in their backyard, just throwing bags out. And until we found out that, people weren't sure what was going on. And then it was a stop and a discussion. And so, you know, it's hard to pinpoint. So it is really a community thing, but it does kind of take some of that community cultural pressure as well. And so that really does need to become, you know, more of a just an acceptance at the community level and trying to get other folks to at least understand why that's necessary. But that can be hard. Change is hard. So but I understand, you know, but some of the reasons that we can't come into some of these issues are how we're set up we're not set up to come in and snipe animals, state fish and wildlife. We also have to take safety in mind. This is an area where safety is a big issue. I can't speak for USDA Wildlife Services, but some of their removal services are in urban and suburban areas, and I imagine that safety is a big issue there, and particularly domestic pets and children. And so it comes down to what's the root of the source here, and the root of the source is the environment, not the coyote itself. And so the environment's creating the individual coyotes occasionally, whether it be every 2 years, every 5 years, every 10 years, that become an issue. And in order to avoid that, in order to deter it when it starts happening too, to have these tools and really get everybody on board doing it. And sometimes, unfortunately, it gets a little bit past that, where, we're nipping it in the bud sort of, when it's gotten a little bit farther than just an animal, perhaps being seen in garbage, for example. So, but our coyotes in urban areas are really easy to have this happen though, because there's a bunch of people, they get disturbed throughout the day. You see them during the day just because they're disturbed. It might not even be a habituated animal. So they get a lot of exposure and a lot of having to move around and put themselves in places where, they may have to, hide under your deck or something real quick because they're mowing at the cemetery and they got kicked out. I've been called about the Queen Anne Cemetery and people mowing on it before, and the coyotes being seen. So, so that's another example. And the Shoreline Cemetery near Lake Ballinger. So it's out there. I'm just trying to normalize it. It's always the same, unfortunately, though. And it's not fun. So,
Chris, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but on that question of it's
Nicole,
always, oh, I'm sorry.
Nicole, let me just level that here. I mean, I think one of the things that would be really great when we come out of this is there are so many great resources, and what we would like to do as the Queen Anne Community Council is to kind of have a toolkit, which is maybe a little bit more than just report it. Because that's what I feel like people are saying, oh, we're going to report it, but what happens next? And I love Chris and Evan and everybody's reacting to us. So we're going to try to kind of put all this information together too, so that people feel a little bit more comfortable if they're having feeling a little bit more of a dangerous situation, that they're not just reporting it. I think that's one of the most important things for us. And I love the educational piece of it. I think that's really, really important. And we do have 2 more questions if you guys are open to them. I see them. And Nicole, did you want to ask your question first?
Lake Forest Park, when they had their last big spike in this, they put together a management plan, and they have some codification as well that I'm going to get into, but they have these volunteer strike teams that they were utilizing. I assume they're still utilizing it. I've not heard from them. Things have been pretty, as far as we understand, okay. That are volunteers in the community that go out and teach people how to haze, and also will haze, but as you can imagine, being at the right place, right time is really difficult. But that might be a resource for you all, is to contact the police department was involved there at Lake Forest Park. You might try them first, and
yeah,
it's on their website as
Chris,
well.
we have that information from Kevin. Thank you. We'll follow up with that. Thank you.
Great.
So we do have 2 hands. I have Laurel. Do you want to unmute yourself, Laurel, if you had a question? Laurel's gone. Dustin?
Oh, sorry. I'm so sorry. I couldn't unmute myself. Can you hear me?
No worries.
Okay. Hi. Sorry. I'm Laurel. I don't know how to use the camera on my phone. I just wanted to say thanks so much for the presentation. And I'm glad to know about the hazing, because my husband and I and our dogs have definitely seen coyotes, and we stare at them. And it sounds like probably we should have been a little bit more like, hey, go away, kind of a thing. I really appreciate Justin's question about when to, what this sort of threshold is that everybody needs to know about in terms of informing people. In terms of the phrase, we've had countless interactions or some sort of concerning events with native wildlife. I actually haven't heard of any, and I'm just curious, have there actually been, or it sounds like there have been, I don't mean to second guess, how many interactions have there been that have been, other than maybe perhaps a loose pet, which again, we shouldn't have our pets loose, cats, dogs, whatever. Have we had issues with leashed animals and human contact?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and jump on that. As far as from what I've received for calls is I've received probably 4 calls about Queen Anne every day. I mean, sorry, every week for about 2 years now. In that time frame, in the last few months, probably 3 months, I'm guessing at the last 3, that it's been 3 individuals that have had negative interactions with coyotes, and that's where they actually came into physical contact with those coyotes. Am I right there, Chris? I mean, I usually sometimes, you guys call me, not the state or anybody, so
Yeah.
I've only been called 3 in the last 3 months that made physical contact.
Yeah, that's about what we had too. And really we only really have like well, the one that we really consider, that got our attention was when someone, their loose dog was out back. And understandably, the coyote got the small dog, and they went to go save the dog, and they grabbed the coyote, and of course the coyote whipped around and tried to bite the person and did break some skin, my understanding. And we're really glad that person's okay. And geez, they get the Superman of the Year award there too. But it reminds me of a video from California where a woman threw a bear over their pony wall. So not a full-grown bear, sub-adult, but it's still it's amazing what adrenaline will do for you. But that's the one that really that got our attention. We've not really heard of other ones, or at least gotten them to me as far as like on leash, et cetera, et cetera. I've heard of some things off leash, and some animals. There was the Seattle Pacific instance where the animal came around the car and the other person came around the car, and there was a touch there as well. So, but as far as breaking skin, it was that backyard instances that I'm familiar with. So
I guess the definition is the question of if breaking skin is the incident, then I don't know. There's been 8 dog bites or grabs with dogs on leash, 7 or 8, and then there was a family sitting at a picnic table in their backyard, bag of groceries, that a coyote came up and the groceries were at their feet on the ground, and a coyote grabbed the bag and ran off. So I don't know. I mean, yeah, the coyote's not coming up and biting a person per se, but the incident that you're talking about where the woman tried to fight off the coyote, or did fight off the coyote, is probably the most concerning thing, because there's been enough incidents where a coyote has bitten a dog, and grabbing the leash and just kind of pulling the dog away has so far worked. But I think the concern is there was more of the incidents of the interaction becoming skin break or worse when pulling the leash back brings a coyote with it.
yeah.
So
No, I
there's
understand.
negative interactions, but I don't know, maybe your definition of negative includes skin breaking and mine includes a coyote not
Well,
running.
yeah, I think maybe a better way for us to put it is, rather than these like categories, what do we see in other parts of Seattle? We see this. What do we see in other parts of King County? We see this. What do we see throughout the range of this animal? We see this. So we're getting calls like this similarly in the Seattle area at the same time. And this is what Coyote does occasionally. And with the animal, with the situation where the dog was in the backyard and the person grabbed the coyote, that did get our attention. We do have coyotes approach people when their dogs are on leash. That can happen, big dog or small dog. So I hadn't heard about those, so I think that's good. I appreciate you sharing that, but I will also say that we have that throughout their local range and throughout where they exist around humans.
Yeah.
Whether you could
I-
take Seattle and just plop us in LA or Chicago or New York, and it'd be very
Yeah.
similar. And the
Chris-
studies of urban coyotes are real similar findings as well, which I think says something to that animal.
Yeah,
But
Chris,
anyway.
I put those resources in the chat, the Lake Forest Park plan being one of them. And one thing those plans do well is kind of define, so that people can talk on the same page about, what happened in each instance, and so that a community would have a better way of kind of approaching, let's log these interactions, characterize them according to these definitions, and then we can really get a sense of kind of what's happening. So hopefully the Queen Anne Community Council will find those resources helpful to come up, with a plan for the community. I think that's an excellent idea for a way forward for the community to know, how are we going to respond? At what point do we take which action?
Can
Yeah,
I
we're- and
follow
we're
up with a
100%
quick, sorry, can I follow up with a quick question on that? Because let's say you
Oh.
get 100% community compliance with the actions of, trying to protect your garden, keep trash, all the things you've suggested tonight, and we get 100% compliance. Is it possible that the habituated coyote will then stop its behavior?
There's no chance.
Yeah. Okay, that's what I wanted to know. So really the community behavior change would be for the next generation of coyotes that are coming through to kind of stop it from escalating.
Correct. As we move forward here, we've circled this a few times. I think we know what the community has to do. We've talked about coyotes on Queen Anne, Magnolia for a long time, especially this area around the cemetery there, having problems. I do this every day. I field coyote calls every day across this state. I'm the supervisor from the mountains west. So I hear about coyote calls every day. I hear them start small and get bigger. When we talk about working with different places, whether it be schools, elementary schools, golf courses, people feeding sandwiches on a golf course, I tell them, you need to put up do not feed wildlife signs. You need to tell your people to stop feeding them food. And okay, we'll do that. Okay, we'll do that. We don't want to lethally remove a coyote and someone gets bit. So I think we know the path that has to move forward for these individuals already. The question is how, and is the community, City of Seattle and Queen Anne, how are we going to work together with our agency and WDFW to get this done?
Yeah, and you've got the choir here on this call with you, but we got 34,000 people in Queen Anne. We're not going to
Understood.
The worst news of all of this is that we have to rely on our own species to fix it, and I don't have a lot of confidence in us.
Understood.
34,000, there's no way.
Huh. What if the
Okay,
wrong?
well,
I mean, it'd be one thing if we lived in North Bend. All this would make total sense. But we're in the neighborhood right next to downtown Seattle. And I hear you, New York, LA, I get it, all the other places. But it hadn't been like this for, until 5 years ago. It's really just gotten bad 1 to 2 years. So we're seeing a trend going from nothing to a lot, right? For whatever reason, right?
Can I
But
ask
30,000 Queen Anne
question?
people aren't going to change their behavior.
One thing we didn't really talk about, I just had a question, is, we talk a lot about development. And, as we see areas in our neighborhood that are typically might be like the habitat for an animal like a coyote, and as that gets developed, how does that change? I know we talked about, if they're mowing the cemetery, then, they might move. But being like fully displaced from where they may have a den, like, how does that change their kind of presence in the rest of the neighborhood or their behavior?
If you disperse those coyotes, there's in the previous presentations, you will have coyotes move back into that area. That open niche will be filled very quickly. When it is filled very quickly, that's up to the community to then start using the tools that were given to them. Hazing,
I mean,
not
if I'm
letting
saying there's an
habituation.
area that we knew there was a coyote den, all the trees were cut down and they built like a series of condos there. So they're like, no more place. I'm just wondering if maybe to answer one of the questions, like maybe why we're seeing them more frequently is because they're homes that were more of a dense like forest doesn't exist anymore. And so they have to like move somewhere else. It was maybe something we're seeing in our neighborhood as you have more development. Maybe that's why you're seeing them. I wanted to just ask.
Possibly. I mean, that's just, it's just such a stochastic nature of that question. But as Dr. Creeling, I'm sorry if I'm saying your name correctly, right? As she said earlier that, we have social media, We have Ring cameras in the last 5 years. All of this is just going to increase the sightings. So generally for me and in the work that I do for wildlife damage, it's not the sightings I'm so worried about. That's actually good data for us as, you know, a game like us for WDFW as a game agency to help manage, you know, that area. That's great data for them. For us as far as damage and the problem that you guys are having in your neighborhood, where I'm more worried isn't the sightings, it's the negative interactions that you're having with the wildlife, or, you know, interactions with them where it wasn't negative or positive, is neutral. That coyote just learned something about you as a human, and yeah, I can follow you because you're going to drop something, or maybe you're scared and drop it and run away from it, and now I'm going to pick it up. Well, that's a good interaction with them. So those are the things that when I field calls that I'm more worried about, and less about how many times are we seeing them. Does that make sense? Did I answer some of that, or am I?
Yeah, that's perfect.
That's great. Thanks.
So we're at the bottom of the hour, and I think this has been fantastic. We're going to capture the chat and all the resources that we captured. I think that, you know, as a community, I think the Queen Anne Community Council would really like to have a really practical toolkit, which is not just what do you do when you see a coyote, but like how do you react, and then understanding all these different pieces, including what Evan's organization does, and just where things land in terms of education and coexistence, but also when things are escalating, which is, I think, what our organization here has been experiencing. So thank you all for your participation. If the panelists would like, I mean, thank you all so much. We're going to stay on. The board is going to stay on for some kind of really boring business. If you want to stay on, you can listen to our minutes and like talking about our treasurer's report. But we really appreciate your participation in our community. We'll be sharing the recording out, and thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody.